Cash and Vale had been living inside fluorescent light for so long that real darkness felt foreign when it finally draped the 29th floor. Past midnight, the Vale Tech executive suite resembled a museum after closing, silent corridors, polished marble, the ghostly hum of servers behind glass. He should have left hours ago. Tomorrow's investor briefing loomed like a meteor, but the spreadsheet on his screen had begun to blur into hieroglyphs. He closed the laptop with a sigh that echoed off the windows and leaned back in the leather chair, massaging the bridge of his nose. A faint melody drifted through the crack of the office door, so soft he wondered at first if it was the HVAC sighing through vents. The tune rose, gentle and lilting, threaded with a language he couldn't place. Curiosity nudged him from his chair. He stepped into the hallway, loosening the knot of his tie as he followed the sound past cubicles and framed magazine covers that chronicled his meteoric ascent. It led him to the panoramic conference room where floor-to-ceiling glass revealed the midnight city like circuitry under black lacquer. There, standing on a low step stool, was a young woman in navy coveralls, wiping the interior of the glass with deliberate strokes. Her back was to him, auburn hair escaping a messy knot at the nape of her neck. As she worked she sang in a clear, untrained alto, a lullaby whose minor chord seemed too old for any radio playlist. For a moment Cashin simply listened, arms folded, letting the melody erode the sediment of board reports and revenue projections that clogged his mind. When she pivoted to reach a higher pain, she noticed him and startled, nearly dropping the microfiber cloth. The song cut off. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vale," she said, voice rushing to fill the silence. "I didn't realize anyone was still here. I'll be out of your way in a second." He raised a placating hand. "No need to apologize. You're singing, what language is it?" A hint of embarrassment colored her cheeks. "Welsh. My grandmother used to hum it when she cooked. Helps pass the time." Cashin nodded, stepping closer, though he kept a respectful distance. "It's beautiful. I'm Cashin." Then he grimaced at his own absurdity. Of course she knew who he was, his surname was etched on the building. But introductions felt necessary, a gesture of equal footing. "Eloan," she offered, climbing down from the stool. Up close he saw freckles dusting the bridge of her nose, and eyes the mottled green of sea glass. She stuffed the cloth into a bucket and reached for a spray bottle. "Night shift is quieter. Less chance of knocking over someone's latte." He smiled, realizing he hadn't done so genuinely in days. "I'm only here because my inbox staged a coup." He glanced at the skyline, headlights tracing arteries along the avenues. "When you finish, let me give you a ride. The subway's a war zone after midnight." She shook her head. "I'm fine, really. I've got a bike locked downstairs." Rain began needling the windows, as if to contradict her. Cashin tilted his head. "At least let my driver follow you. Flashing hazards make a good shield against cab doors." Eloan considered, then shrugged assent. "If it makes you feel less guilty for keeping the lights on." While she packed her supplies into a wheeled cart, Cashin fetched his coat and messenger bag. In the elevator he noticed she kept one hand on the cart handle like a talisman. To break the hush he asked how long she'd worked for Sterling Janitorial. 2 months, she said. "It's temporary. Day job at Sunrise Bakery doesn't cover rent since they raised prices on flour." The elevator dinged. They crossed the marble lobby, their footsteps echoing under recessed lighting. Outside, rain slicked the pavement, distorting neon into ribbons. His chauffeur, Malik, sprang from the idling sedan with an umbrella. Cashin instructed him to trail Eloan's bike at a safe distance until she reached home. Malik nodded, unconcerned. Eccentric requests were currency in the Vale orbit. Eloan unlocked a battered blue bicycle from a rack. "You really don't have to." "I know," Cashin interrupted, holding the umbrella while she adjusted her messenger bag. "But I'd prefer you not become a headline about reckless drivers. Vale Tech has enough PR headaches." She laughed, a short, genuine bark that revealed a chipped incisor. Fair point. Thanks, Mr. Vale, Cashin. She mounted the bike, rain peppering her sleeves, then hesitated. You should try leaving before midnight sometime. The city sounds different. He watched her pedal into the street, Malik's sedan gliding behind like a silent guardian. The rain softened, muffling traffic into a distant surf. Cashin realized he was still smiling. Inside the car, heading uptown to his sterile penthouse, he replayed the lullaby in his mind, trying to remember the last time a song, any song, had cut through the static of quarterly earnings. At a red light he opened his phone, thumb hovering over a contact list filled with executives and lobbyists. Impulse guided him to the browser instead. He typed, Welsh lullaby grandmother sings window cleaning, and hit search, unsure what he expected to find, maybe lyrics, maybe nothing. The screen offered translations of Suagan, rest my child, sleep serenely. He leaned back, reading the words while the city blurred past, and felt the gears of his life grind against something softer, almost forgotten. When the sedan pulled up to his building, Malik handed over a small slip of paper. Miss Price asked me to give you this, sir. Cashin unfolded it. In neat block letters, thank you for the escort. The song is called Suagan. YouTube has better versions than mine. E. He slipped the note into his breast pocket like contraband. Upstairs, the penthouse lights blinked on via motion sensor, illuminating curated art and minimalist furniture. Cashin set his laptop on the kitchen island but didn't open it. Instead he poured 2 fingers of Japanese whiskey and stood by the window where rain traced erratic paths down the glass. Somewhere out there a young woman in coveralls was chaining her bike, maybe humming a lullaby to herself. He raised the glass in a silent toast and took a slow sip, letting the burn remind him he was still capable of feeling something other than obligation. The investor briefing remained unfinished, but for the first time in months he didn't care. He cued Suagan on his phone, let the notes drift through the empty rooms, and wondered why a single melody could make a glass tower feel less like a fortress and more like a place where life might actually begin. Cashin Vale arrived at Vale Tech headquarters the next morning trailing the scent of cedar soap and unresolved curiosity. The Suagan recording he had played on loop overnight still lingered in his ears as he stepped onto the trading floor mezzanine, a terraced arena where analysts juggled 6 screens apiece and the news ticker scrolled like a heartbeat across the walls. The weekly investor briefing loomed in 40 minutes, and Marcellus Grant, his discreetly brilliant CFO, was already pacing by the glass railing, tablet in hand. Asia numbers? Cashin asked by way of greeting. Better than expected, Marcellus replied, falling into step. But the board wants color on the semiconductor shortage and the new wage equity push. I slotted it at the end of the deck. Cashin nodded, but his mind flicked to Aloan balancing a tray of scones, not supply chains. He caught himself, redirected focus, and entered the executive war room where 10 directors dialed in from Zurich, Singapore, and, most critically, Boston, where Percival Dorne kept his empire of private equity sharks well fed. Cashin delivered the update with practiced clarity, yet as charts flickered he caught his reflection in the monitor, a man who suddenly looked like an understudy in his own life. After the call Marcellus lingered. You were different today. Less steel, more velvet. Whatever you did last night, do it again. Cashin almost confessed about the lullaby and the rain escort, but he pocketed the story, offering only a cryptic shrug before retreating to his office. He opened his calendar, scrolling past cocktail receptions and product demos until Friday evening glowed free of obligation. On impulse he drafted a message to Malik, need car Friday 7 p.m. Williamsburg. He hesitated, then added a second text, please locate Sunrise Bakery employee schedule, Aloan Price. Across the East River, Aloan's dawn began with the shrill chorus of the bakery's industrial mixer. She measured flour, sugar, and a pinch of nutmeg, shoulders still sore from the bike ride. Malik's sedan had tailed her discreetly, hazards blinking, until she chained the bike outside her apartment building. She'd waved at the driver, embarrassed and oddly touched, then trudged upstairs to a room barely large enough for a twin bed and a wall shelf crowded with second-hand cameras. Sleep had come fast, but Cassion's unexpected kindness replayed itself between dreams, threaded with the worry that generosity often carried price tags she couldn't afford. Now, covered in flour dust, she slid trays of brioche into the oven while Mrs. Alvarez, the owner, tallied receipts. At 9 the front bell chimed and a cluster of tech interns spilled in, laughing over last night's bar crawl. Eloane served lattes and avocado toasts, her smile automatic until the door opened again and Malik stepped inside, sharply pressed in chauffeur black. He approached the counter, removed a folded note from his breast pocket, and placed it beside the tip jar. "From Mr. Vale," he said softly, then ordered 24 cinnamon rolls, corporate catering, he claimed. Eloane's co-workers exchanged wide-eyed looks, but Malik remained impervious. When he left, Eloane unfolded the note. Friday, 7 p.m. There's a street fair pop-up on Kent Avenue, live jazz, good tacos. May I claim 1 hour of your time? See. She stared at the script, elegant yet slightly rushed, as if he'd written it between stock projections. Mrs. Alvarez leaned over the counter, eyebrows arched. Is that the same Mr. Vale whose name is on half the skyline? Eloane folded the paper. He's a client. Long story. Make sure it's a happy one, the older woman advised, sliding a warm roll into a wax bag and pressing it into Eloane's hands. Friday arrived draped in gold-rimmed clouds. Cassion spent the afternoon in a patent law teleconference that threatened to last until sunrise. At 6 he cut the call short, unprecedented, and told Marcellus he had personal plans. The CFO's brows rose in silent approval. Cassion changed into dark jeans and a navy bomber jacket that hadn't seen daylight since a product launch concert 2 years earlier. Malik eased the sedan through rush-hour traffic to the bakery just as Eloane emerged in a green cotton dress, camera bag slung over one shoulder. She greeted Cassion with a half-wave, half-salute, the wind teasing strands of hair free. He opened the passenger door himself, ignoring the umbrella Malik proffered, and the two settled into the leather back seat, a small hush blooming between them. I hope this isn't an imposition, Cassion began. If it were, I wouldn't be here, Eloane answered, tone light but eyes searching. Besides, I've never been to a pop-up jazz fair. The sedan stopped near a reclaimed waterfront lot strung with Edison bulbs. Food trucks formed a semicircle around a plywood stage where a quartet eased into a Coltrane standard. The Hudson smelled of salt and diesel, laughter skated over the music. Cassion bought tacos from a vendor who recognized him and tried, unsuccessfully, not to stare. They found a bench near a barrel fire heater. Between bites Cassion asked about the Welsh lullaby. Eloane explained her grandmother's coal mining village, the songs that kept children quiet during blackouts. She admitted she'd come to New York chasing a photography scholarship that evaporated when funding was cut. Cleaning offices and frosting cinnamon rolls were placeholders until she could afford her own darkroom again. Cassion listened, taco forgotten, feeling the tectonic plates of his priorities shift. He confessed that Vailteca's first prototype, a wearable glucose sensor, had been inspired by his sister's brittle diabetes diagnosis, but venture capital had pushed him toward more profitable horizons. He spoke of quarterly expectations as shackles, and for the first time Eloane saw not the headline CEO but a man cornered by his own success. A drizzle began, soft at first, then insistent. Festival-goers darted under awnings. Cassion grabbed Eloane's hand and led her beneath the stage canopy where the quartet kept playing, saxophone slicing the rain-damp air. They stood close, the space too narrow for corporate distance. Eloane's pulse thudded in her ears louder than the bass line. You'll ruin your jacket, she murmured. Let it, he said, surprising them both. She met his gaze, storm-gray eyes reflecting string lights, and the moment stretched, fragile as spun sugar. A cymbal brushed, the city's skyline glittered beyond the rain, and Cassion kissed her, tentative but certain, like someone testing a locked door and finding it open. When they finally stepped back, breath mingling in white puffs, Eloane laughed, a bright, astonished sound. That was unexpected. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday at 2:07 a.m., he admitted, then flushed at the precision. She shook her head, half amused, half moved. You timed it? I timestamp everything important, he said with a crooked grin. Occupational hazard. Rain eased to a mist. They wandered back toward the car, hands brushing. Malik pretended not to notice the change in atmosphere as he held the door. On the ride home, Cashin asked if she'd let him photograph her sometime, turning her own lens back on the photographer. She teased that CEOs rarely know aperture from ISO, but he countered with the equation for f-stop, and she conceded with a smile. Outside her apartment building, she paused on the sidewalk, rain-slicked streetlights haloing her hair. Thank you for tonight, she said, voice softer than the drizzle. But remember, this city can flip scripts without warning. I'm counting on it, Cashin replied. She leaned in, pressed a quick kiss to his cheek, and disappeared into the vestibule, leaving the scent of cinnamon and rainwater in her wake. Cashin touched the spot on his cheek as Malik pulled away. In the rearview mirror the driver caught his eye. Good evening, sir. The best in a long time, Cashin answered. Back at the penthouse he opened the window despite the chill, letting the city's wet asphalt aroma fill the room. He booted his laptop, but instead of spreadsheets he created a new folder, Project Aloan. Inside he drafted a note to HR requesting tuition reimbursement expansion for part-time employees, then another to R&D about revisiting the glucose sensor. Before shutting down, he typed a final email, to himself, timestamp 23:48, tonight the script flipped. Do not let it flip back. Across the river, Aloan hung her damp dress by the radiator and set her camera on the sill. She scrolled through mental snapshots, tacos, string lights, the look on Cashin's face just before he kissed her. She opened her notebook and sketched a timeline of goals, but beneath, save for darkroom, she added a new line, allow the unexpected to matter. Outside, the rain slowed to a hush, as if the city were catching its breath before the next verse of a song neither of them yet knew by heart. The next 6 weeks unspooled like a reel of film that had never been developed, each frame exposing a new layer of intimacy between Cashin and Aloan. They were careful at first, mid-morning coffees in the park outside the bakery, late-night phone calls that began with jokes about disastrous recipes and ended with quiet confessions about childhood scars. Cashin discovered that Aloan collected broken Polaroid cameras the way some people collected books. She kept them on a shelf, each tagged with a handwritten label explaining how it had failed and what she planned to salvage. Aloan, in turn, learned that Cashin ran 8 miles every dawn not for fitness but to outrun a persistent insomnia he'd inherited from his father. Their worlds began to overlap in small, undeniable ways. Vailteca's cafeteria suddenly carried Sunrise Bakery pastries on Wednesdays, a coincidence no one bothered to question. Aloan's apartment gained a second-hand drafting table that appeared on her stoop one morning with a note, for darkroom plans, not spreadsheets. When Cashin's board schedule pulled him into marathon sessions, Aloan sent him voice memos of street musicians playing outside the bakery, the clatter of subway doors, even the hiss of her espresso machine, city sounds to remind him life existed beyond quarterly earnings. One snowy Saturday Cashin invited her to a private viewing at the Museum of Modern Art, where Vailtec sponsored a retrospective on analog photography. They wandered the dim galleries, stopping before a 1960s Diane Arbus portrait of twins in matching dresses. Aloan studied the image for a long time, tracing the symmetry with her eyes. Cashin asked what she saw. Potential, she answered. 2 lives that could diverge or collide at any moment. The guard announced closing time, and the hush of the empty museum felt like permission rather than eviction. In the cab home they kissed again, a slow, lingering press of mouths that tasted of peppermint tea and anticipation. The first snowstorm of the year arrived 2 nights later, smothering Brooklyn in white. Cashin's driver refused to risk the bridges, so Cashin himself trudged the 5 blocks from the subway to Aloan's building, his suit pants soaked to the knee. She met him at the door with blankets and hot cocoa spiked with rum. They watched the snow spiral past the window, talking until the radiator clanked its protest at the hour. When she shivered, He wrapped the blanket around both of them, and the conversation dwindled into a silence heavy with possibility. The first time they made love, it was slow and awkward and perfect, laughter breaking the tension when his elbow knocked over a jar of paintbrushes she kept by the bed. The storm swallowed the city's noise, leaving only their breaths and the ticking of an old clock as witnesses. After that night their routines fused. Cashin left toothbrush and running shoes by her door, Eloan kept a spare apron in his penthouse laundry room. Yet neither spoke of labels or futures, the present was fragile enough to cradle without squeezing. Then, in late February, the balance shifted. Eloan had felt off for days, nausea that the bakery's buttersweet air only worsened, fatigue that no amount of coffee chased away. She blamed a lingering flu until Mrs. Alvarez asked, with maternal bluntness, when her last period had been. Eloan's mind stuttered. She did the math twice, then a third time, each calculation ending in the same blank square on her calendar. That afternoon she bought a pregnancy test at a bodega, hiding it beneath a loaf of bread. The bakery's restroom was barely big enough to turn around, but it offered privacy. She waited the instructed minutes, heart drumming against her ribs, until two unmistakable pink lines appeared. Her knees buckled, she gripped the sink, breathing through a surge of fear and wonder. Twins, the Arbus portrait whispered from memory, potential doubled. She couldn't call Cashin, he was in Boston negotiating a licensing deal. Instead she walked the neighborhood for an hour, snowmelt seeping into her shoes, until the shock settled into a low-grade tremor. Back at the bakery she stashed the test in her locker, promised Mrs. Alvarez she was fine, and finished the shift on autopilot. That night she Googled prenatal clinics, insurance coverage, and the statistical odds of twin pregnancies. The numbers blurred, but one fact shone, she had to tell Cashin. He returned Sunday evening, weary but triumphant, the licensing deal secured. She met him at the penthouse, where he uncorked a bottle of Gruner Veltliner to celebrate. Halfway through the first glass she set it down, hands shaking. He noticed instantly, worry etching his brow. She took a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff and said, "I'm pregnant." The words hung between them, fragile as soap bubbles. Then she added, "with twins." Cashin's face went still, the CEO mask dropping into something raw and unguarded. For a heartbeat she feared the silence meant regret, but his eyes filled, not with panic, but with a fierce, almost reverent awe. He reached for her hand, threading their fingers. "You're sure?" She nodded, tears she hadn't realized she was holding spilling over. He pulled her into an embrace that felt like a vow, whispering, "We'll figure everything out together." They spent the night on the living room floor, documents and laptops untouched while they mapped possibilities on scraps of printer paper, names, apartment sizes, prenatal specialists, the logistics of car seats in chauffeur-driven sedans. Cashin confessed he'd always imagined fatherhood in some distant, safer decade. Eloan admitted she'd assumed children were luxuries reserved for people who didn't worry about rent. By dawn, exhaustion folded them into each other's arms. Before sleeping, Cashin pressed his palm to Eloan's still flat abdomen, marveling that an entire future, multiplied by 2, rested beneath his hand. Outside, the storm clouds lifted, revealing a city rinsed clean. Cashin cancelled his morning run, choosing instead to watch Eloan sleep, freckles stark against her pillowcase. He realized that the insomnia he'd battled for years had evaporated during the night, replaced by a clarity that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. 2 pink lines on a stick had redrawn the borders of his meticulously charted life, and for the first time he welcomed the uncertainty. Cashin woke to the hush of early morning, the penthouse windows tinted pale by the rising sun. He shifted on the couch, careful not to jostle the cushion where Eloan had finally dozed off. Stacks of legal pads and printouts surrounded them like the debris of a late-night strategy session. A half-eaten plate of strawberries sat on the coffee table, next to a rapidly cooling mug of chamomile tea. The entire scene felt surreal. Only a month earlier, he had measured his life by investor calls and IPO timelines, never imagining he'd be here, planning for twins. Eloan stirred, eyelids fluttering open. She blinked at him with the dazed expression of someone drifting between worlds. When realization settled, a pregnancy, 2 babies, a love she hadn't asked for but now couldn't bear to lose, her lips parted in a tentative smile. Cashin brushed her hair back from her face, an intimacy he once would have found inconceivable. They had spent half the night circling the question, how would they merge her modest life with his high-stakes corporate existence? Every route felt fraught with hidden traps, whether from the tabloids, from Vailteca's board, or from her own lingering anxiety that all good things come at a cost. When the doorman rang upstairs to announce Marcellus Grant's arrival, Cashin's pulse kicked. He'd summoned his CFO because he trusted Marcellus like family, though trusting anyone, even a friend, with this kind of news was a monumental risk. Eloan straightened, smoothing wrinkles from her oversized t-shirt. Cashin squeezed her hand, then buzzed Marcellus up. Moments later, the CFO stepped into the living room, gaze darting between the scattered documents and Eloan's anxious expression. They sat around the marble coffee table, as if about to tackle a quarterly report. Cashin explained, voice steady despite the quake in his chest, that Eloan was pregnant and they intended to keep the babies, and each other, in their lives. Marcellus, to his credit, merely exhaled in a whoosh and asked how he could help. Relief washed through Cashin, who had braced for a lecture about reputation and market volatility. Instead, Marcellus drew out his phone and rattled off a list of prenatal specialists and a handful of discreet insurance contacts. But as the conversation turned to Vailteca's future, Marcellus's tone grew sober. He reminded Cashin that Percival Dorne and the private equity faction of the board had been circling for an opportunity to tighten their grip. A scandal, any scandal, might give them the leverage to push Cashin aside. The CFO acknowledged that corporate lawyers would almost certainly draft non-disclosure agreements and push for a quiet resolution. Eloan looked stricken, and Cashin felt anger spike. He had no intention of treating the woman he loved or his unborn children like inconvenient footnotes in a contract. That afternoon, Cashin returned to Vailteca's headquarters feeling like he walked into a coliseum. The building's lobby soared in steel and marble, the walls hung with motivational quotes from the founder, his father, gone these 10 years. In the executive elevator, he loosened his tie, swallowing a surge of dread. It was time to face Dorne. Marcellus had arranged an impromptu board meeting under the guise of updating them on a new product prototype, but Cashin knew the real topic would be Eloan's pregnancy. They convened in the glass-walled boardroom on the 35th floor. Dorne sat at the head of the table with an air of proprietary smugness that churned Cashin's stomach. The other directors, some loyal to Cashin, some aligned with Dorne, shifted uneasily in their ergonomic chairs. Cashin opened with a quick progress report on Vailteca's upcoming microprocessor deals, using it as a buffer before he spoke the truth that couldn't stay buried. As soon as he mentioned his personal situation, referencing Eloan in respectful but unmistakable terms, the board exploded in whispered side comments. Dorne cleared his throat with theatrical gravity, then laid out his position. Vailtec prided itself on a clean, public image, and any rumor of an affair with an employee, especially one from a different socio-economic sphere, could tank investor confidence. Dorne folded his hands and suggested a private settlement to avoid negative press. The word settlement and hush money hovered like stale smoke. Cashin fought the urge to slam his fist on the gleaming table. Instead, he spoke calmly about autonomy, love, and responsibility. He declared that he would stand by Eloan fully. The children would know they were wanted, not hidden behind corporate spin. For a moment, the directors seemed stunned by his unguarded defiance. Then Dorne turned the knife, reminding everyone that shareholders could call for a vote of no confidence if the CEO destabilized the brand. A hush descended. Cashin felt an unexpected wave of clarity. He would not yield. If it cost him the company, then perhaps it was time to re-examine his priorities. But another voice spoke up from the corner, an older director, Ms. Reyes, who had watched Cashin grow from intern to chief executive. She said that brand authenticity mattered now more than ever. Consumers respected leaders who embraced real life rather than burying it. Her words sparked a debate that lit around the table like brushfire. A few were appalled by the idea of parading personal drama, others cited modern marketing studies that championed authenticity. Through it all, Cashin stood tall, refusing to back down. The conversation reached no conclusion, ending in an uneasy stalemate with a promise to revisit the issue once heads had cooled. Back at the penthouse that evening, Cashin recounted the meeting to Eloan. She listened in tense silence, knees drawn to her chest on the couch. He could see the fear in her eyes, fear that her mere existence could derail everything he'd built, or that his loyalty would snap under the weight of corporate pressure. He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his, speaking in a low, unwavering voice. She was not an inconvenience or a liability. She was the only part of his life that felt undeniably real. Their babies, too, were not burdens but gifts. If he had to choose between board approval and the family they were becoming, it wasn't even a question. Eloan's eyes filled with tears. She had heard all her life that love was conditional, that men with wealth and power rarely chose the messy over the manageable. Cashin's determination broke something open inside her, a decades-long suspicion that she might never truly belong. They held each other for a long time. When she fell asleep against his chest, he made a silent vow that no matter how brutal the battle, he would fight to protect this fragile, extraordinary reality. Late that night, the skyline stretched beyond the windows in shimmering patterns, but Cashin's gaze stayed on Eloan's sleeping form. The future loomed, pregnant with conflict. Dorne would not yield easily, tabloids might swarm, and a tide of gossip threatened to erode their sanctuary. Yet beneath the anxiety, Cashin felt a fierce hope. The board's ultimatum had only clarified what mattered most. He scrolled through his messages until he found a half-drafted email to the Vailtech communications team. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, heart pounding. With a decisive breath, he typed a final sentence, scheduling it to send at dawn. I will not compromise my family for the sake of public perception. Prepare a statement of acknowledgement, not apology. The hush of the apartment pressed in around him. In Eloan's soft breathing he heard the lullaby of an uncharted life, one that refused to be whittled down to a footnote by lawyers or board members. He closed the laptop, kissed her forehead, and surrendered to a sleep free of fear. The first tabloid leak hit the city like a thunderclap 2 days after the board meeting. A grainy telephoto shot, Cashin and Eloan leaving her apartment at dawn, his hand curved protectively around the small of her back, appeared on the homepage of the most voracious gossip site, accompanied by the headline, "$1 billion baby bump." Within hours the image ricocheted across social media. Financial pundits dissected what an illegitimate heir might do to Vailtech's valuation, while lifestyle bloggers cooed over the possibility of a Cinderella romance. By noon, a second photo surfaced, Eloan inside Sunrise Bakery, one hand pressed to her stomach as she laughed with a coworker. The comments section became a battleground of admiration and derision. Cashin had expected leaks. Percival Dorne practically fed reporters for sport, but the ferocity still stunned him. When he arrived at headquarters, camera crews clustered outside the revolving doors, microphones thrust forward like bayonets. Security ushered him through a side entrance, but not before a journalist shouted a question that sliced deeper than it should have: "Is she just another liability you'll pay off?" Cashin's jaw tightened. Inside the elevator, he punched the emergency stop between floors and braced both palms against the mirrored wall, forcing himself to breathe until the anger receded enough to think. Marcellus met him in the executive corridor with fresh damage reports. Vailtech stock was down 4% on rumors that the board would oust him. 2 institutional investors had requested a call to discuss leadership stability. Cashin thanked him, then asked a question he'd never voiced aloud: if I walked away, would the company survive? Marcellus answered without hesitation that Vailtech's culture would hemorrhage talent. The real value wasn't the patents but the people who believed Cashin's vision mattered. The words lodged in Cashin's chest. Vision. What good was vision if he couldn't protect the people he loved? He retreated to his office and called Eloan. She answered on the second ring, voice calm but brittle. Protesters, half supportive, half hostile, had gathered outside the bakery, chanting slogans that turned her private life into clickbait poetry. Mrs. Alvarez had shuttered the doors for the day. Eloan insisted she was safe, but the background noise of shouting contradicted her. Cashin told her to pack a bag. Malik was already on his way. When he hung up, he drafted an email to the board requesting an emergency evening session. By dusk, Eloan sat in Cashin's penthouse, wrapped in one of his cashmere sweaters. She stared at the city's grid of lights while he paced, rehearsing arguments for the board. Suddenly she spoke, voice small, "I don't want our children Googling themselves one day and finding out they were almost bought off." Cashin stopped pacing. The simplicity of her fear cut through strategy and ego. He crossed the room, knelt, and took her hands. Words spilled before he could temper them, promises about steadfastness, about a future built on something stronger than optics. And then, almost as an afterthought but entirely sincere, "Marry me tomorrow. Not for headlines, because I want every contract in my life to have your signature on it." Eloan's eyes widened, reflecting city light. "Tomorrow?" He nodded. A rooftop, a sunrise, a handful of people who mattered. Her lips curved into a tremulous smile. "Yes. Before someone else writes the story for us." The night became a flurry of clandestine logistics. Marcellus called in a favor with the city clerk for a special license waiver. Sibylla, Vailteca's septuagenarian head housekeeper and keeper of corporate secrets, arrived with a garment bag containing a simple ivory slip dress she'd once sewn for her own daughter. Dr. Imogen Rhodes, Eloan's newly retained obstetrician, insisted on attending with a portable Doppler in case stress triggered complications. Malik arranged battery-powered lanterns and space heaters for the rooftop, where snow still lingered in crystalline drifts. At 5:41 a.m., the service elevator opened onto the Vailtec roof. The horizon blushed lavender. Cashin wore a charcoal suit, no tie, the top button undone as if to prove he could breathe freely in his own kingdom. Eloan stepped onto the makeshift aisle between planters dusted with frost, her dress swaying against her calves. Sibylla pinned a single white camellia in her hair. It had survived the winter in the greenhouse Cashin kept for employee wellness initiatives no one used until now. Marcellus, ordained online the night before, waited beside a wrought iron bistro table that served as altar. The only audience, Sibylla, Dr. Rhodes, and a maintenance drone hovering discreetly to capture footage for the couple alone. No photographers, no stylists, no press, just wind, city hum, and two heartbeats amplified by the still-hidden twins. Marcellus opened a leather notebook. "We are gathered," he paused, smiling at the intimacy of the phrase. "Actually, we are huddled, because love doesn't always wait for perfect conditions." The small group chuckled, breath fogging. He invited Cashin to speak first. Cashin took Eloan's hands, warmth seeping through their entwined fingers. "I used to measure success in patents and percentages. Then I heard a Welsh lullaby in a dark conference room, and the scale recalibrated. You taught me that value isn't what we own, it's what we're willing to risk. I promise to risk everything for you and the two lives we've made." Eloan's eyes glistened. "I came to this city to capture truth with a camera. You turned the lens on yourself and showed me a truth I didn't know I needed, that even broken things, like my thrift store Polaroids, can produce beauty. I promise our children will grow up knowing that story." She pressed his grandfather's signet ring, a last-minute stand-in for a formal band, onto his finger. He slid Sibylla's pearl-handled sewing thimble, repurposed with a gold band inside, onto hers. The symbolism of mending felt apt. Marcellus pronounced them husband and wife just as the sun breached the skyline, gilding skyscraper glass. Cashin kissed Eloan, the city's roar rising like applause. Dr. Rhodes waved the Doppler wand over Eloan's abdomen, twin heartbeats crackled through the cold air, a private symphony no microphone could pirate. Cashin closed his eyes, letting the rhythm imprint on memory. They celebrated with thermoses of hot chocolate and croissants Sibylla had smuggled from the employee cafeteria. No champagne, Eloan couldn't drink, and Cashin refused to toast without her. Malik snapped a single Polaroid with Eloan's refurbished camera, the couple silhouetted against the sun, breath visible, hands resting on the small swell of impending life. An hour later, while the city below yawned into Monday, Cashin emailed the board a succinct message: married at sunrise. Statement to press forthcoming. Family is non-negotiable. See, Dorne's reply arrived within minutes, a terse warning about fiduciary irresponsibility. Cashin forwarded it to Marcellus with a two-word instruction: let's pivot. By noon, Vailteca's social channels posted the rooftop photo alongside a press release. CEO Cashin Vale and artist Eloan Price announce marriage and forthcoming twins, reaffirming the company's commitment to family-centered innovation. The release highlighted new parental leave policies and a scholarship fund for underrepresented creatives, initiatives Cashin had drafted during the night's adrenaline rush. Financial news outlets initially bristled, but when Vailteca's midday demo of its affordable medical microprocessor went viral, featuring a pediatric patient whose monitor cost a tenth of the industry standard, the narrative shifted. Headlines paired the love story with the tech breakthrough: hearts and heart monitors. The stock, after an early dip, clawed back its losses. That evening, Cashin and Eloan returned to the rooftop alone. The lanterns still glowed faintly, their batteries dying. Snowmelt dripped from the planters, sounding like applause slowed to a heartbeat. Eloan leaned into Cashin's side, resting her head on his shoulder. "We rewrote the story," she whispered. He kissed the top of her head. "Chapter 1 of the new draft," he said, imagining the future: board battles, midnight feedings, product launches, first steps, first words. All of it messy, public, imperfect, exactly the kind of life worth living. Cashin's rooftop wedding bought him 48 hours of goodwill before Wall Street turned feral. On Wednesday morning, a hedge fund newsletter labeled his vows the most expensive sunrise in tech history, predicting Vailteca's shares would crater once institutional investors digested the optics: impulsive CEO, surprise heirs, lavish perks for a former janitor. By noon the stock was down 8% on record volume. Financial pundits filled airtime with speculation that Percival Dorne's faction would call an emergency vote to replace Cashin with a steadier hand. In the penthouse nursery, still just a spare room stacked with paint cans and unassembled cribs, Eloan listened to the pundits while sorting baby clothes Sibylla had rescued from storage. Every dip in the ticker felt like a tremor beneath her feet. Cashin, pacing the living room floor below, fielded frantic calls from brand managers who wanted him to issue a mea culpa and retreat from the spotlight. Instead he summoned Marcellus and the R&D chief, Kieran Holt, for an overnight war council. They gathered in the kitchen, blueprints and takeout cartons crowding the island. Cashin pointed to a schematic labeled Project Larkspur, a low-cost microprocessor for portable medical devices that had languished in Vailteca's archives because margins were thin and insurers slow to reimburse. "We bring this to market in 90 days, he said. Kieran choked on his dumpling. 90 days was impossible under normal circumstances, regulatory clearance alone took 6 months. Cashin countered with a plan: partner directly with a children's hospital for a limited humanitarian exemption, live-stream the first implantation surgery, and release the design specs to universities under an open-source license. Profit would come later from peripheral software and maintenance contracts. Marcellus's eyes lit with cautious excitement, Kieran's with terror. Cashin asked Eloan, hovering at the doorway, what she thought. She studied the renderings: tiny chips that could power heart monitors, insulin pumps, cochlear implants. "If we can save one kid before our girls are born," she said quietly, "let's sprint." The next 3 weeks blurred into caffeine-fueled engineering marathons. Vailtec converted an unused clean room into a 24-hour Larkspur assembly line, staffed by volunteers from every department: coders soldering leads, marketing interns packaging sterile trays, even Sibylla sewing anti-static caps. Eloan, barred from fumes by Dr. Rhodes, documented the frenzy with her Leica, faces streaked with fatigue, whiteboards dense with equations, a janitor high-fiving a senior engineer over a successful stress test. Outside, early spring storms battered Manhattan, snarling traffic and shorting power grids. Inside Vale Tech the storm was financial. Dorne's camp leaked internal memos questioning Cashin's competence, and short sellers piled in. The share price slid another 6%. Marcellus warned that if Larkspur failed, the board would not merely replace Cashin, they'd dismantle his reforms. Cashin pushed harder. He flew to St. Elora Children's Hospital in Boston, where Dr. Akira Sato agreed to pilot the first Larkspur-powered heart monitor on a 7-year-old patient named Mia Alvarez, no relation to Eloan's bakery boss, but the coincidence felt like cosmic endorsement. The FDA granted a compassionate use waiver. Cashin scheduled the live stream for a Thursday at 10 a.m., 2 days before the next board meeting. "We either write the narrative," he told his exhausted team, "or the market writes our obituary." The night before surgery, thunder rattled the penthouse windows. Eloan couldn't sleep, the twins kicked like drumbeats. Cashin sat on the nursery floor assembling a crib he'd insisted on building himself, with screws clinking as rain hammered the glass. At 2 a.m. his phone pinged. Dorne had filed a motion for an emergency leadership vote if the stock fell below a trigger price, $20 a share, within 48 hours. Vale Tech was now $8 from that precipice. Cashin stared at the screen, then at the half-built crib, and felt the two futures, collapse or creation, balance on a blade. Surgery morning broke silver and wet. In the hospital's or observation deck, Cashin, Eloan, Marcellus, and a skeleton camera crew took their positions. Eloan adjusted the Leica's ISO against the sterile fluorescence. On the screen below, Mia lay tiny and motionless while Dr. Sato guided the micro-monitor into place, the Larkspur chip no larger than a fingernail. A timer in the live stream corner counted seconds. Online viewership climbed past 250,000, then 500,000, as tech bloggers and medical forums tuned in. At the 40-minute mark a sensor alarm beeped, everyone in the observation deck froze, but Dr. Sato calmly explained it was a calibration spike. 2 minutes later Mia's heart rhythm appeared on the external display, steady, vibrant, rendered by Vale Tech hardware that cost $91 to manufacture. The chat exploded with emojis and expletives of relief. Cashin exhaled a breath he'd been holding for months. He squeezed Eloan's hand. She captured the moment, his eyes wet, her smile incandescent despite the surgical mask. By the time they landed back in New York that evening, Larkspur's hashtag trended globally. Parents of children with congenital conditions flooded Vale Tech's inboxes. University labs requested development kits. More astonishing, the stock surged 11% in after-hours trading, wiping out the month's losses. The trigger price vanished in the rearview mirror. Dorne convened the board the next morning, prepared to spin the rally as proof that his pressure had disciplined Cashin. Instead he walked into a conference room where half the directors were already wearing Larkspur lapel pins, handed out by Marcellus. Cashin joined via video from the penthouse, Eloan seated beside him, no makeup, maternity sweater stretched over the twins. Behind them, the completed crib and a half-painted mural of constellations made a wordless argument: innovation could coexist with humanity. Cashin began by presenting preliminary sales inquiries and philanthropic partnerships. Then he pivoted, citing internal records that showed Dorne's private fund had increased its short position during the lowest dip, betting against the company while still serving as chairman. Gasps rippled. Dorne sputtered denials, but Marcellus shared a time-stamped trade ledger. A vote of no confidence in Dorne passed 7-2. He was escorted out, his protests echoing down the hallway. After the meeting, Cashin closed his laptop and turned to Eloan. She rested a hand on her belly, feeling twin kicks like applause. "We bought time," he said. "Now we have to earn it." She replied, "We already did. We just have to keep telling the truth." That evening they returned to the rooftop where they'd married. The storm front had moved on, leaving the sky scrubbed clean. Cashin projected the Larkspur surgery highlight onto the blank facade of the adjacent building. Mia's first stable heartbeat fluttered 30 stories high. Employees drifted onto balconies to watch, some cheering, some wiping tears. Eloan lifted her Leica for one more frame, Cashin's silhouette against his own creation, hope writ large on glass and concrete. When they descended to the nursery, the mural was finished, twin constellations, mirrored across the ceiling. Cashin lay on the floor, gazing up at the stars he had painted, and felt the magnitude of what lay ahead: midnight feedings, regulatory audits, second and third product launches, first steps, perhaps more storms. Yet in the quiet between thunderclaps, he had found the metric that mattered: the number of hearts beating because Vailtech chose purpose over profit margin. Outside, the city lights shimmered, reflecting off puddles like broken circuits mended by rain. Inside, Cashin and Eloan stood beneath a sky they had crafted by hand, ready to chart the rest of their improbable constellation. The days after the boardroom showdown felt like the calm before a storm that Cashin knew was still brewing. The success of Larkspur and the surge in Vailtech's stock gave him a brief reprieve, but the consequences of his stand, of marrying Eloan and defying the corporate world that had raised him, were far from over. He couldn't shake the feeling that the other shoe was always about to drop, and this time, it wasn't just a matter of business. Eloan was becoming more than just the woman he loved. She was becoming the center of his world in ways he hadn't expected. She was due in less than a month, and despite all the late-night strategy sessions and media calls, he found himself spending hours at her side, discussing the future of their children. It was a kind of calm he had never known, this space between them, where love wasn't measured in dollar signs or stock tickers but in shared dreams and quiet moments. They spent evenings in the nursery she had designed herself, picking out colors for the walls and sorting through baby clothes, onesies printed with little elephants, soft wool blankets she'd knitted herself during sleepless nights. It was simple, intimate, and the exact opposite of the high-stakes world Cashin had built. But just as he had begun to think that perhaps he could balance the chaotic corporate life with the peaceful domesticity Eloan had introduced him to, the news came. It wasn't a call, or an email, or even a text. It was an anonymous letter, slipped under his office door in the dead of night. The letter was handwritten on thick, cream stationery, and the words were carefully constructed, each letter appearing more deliberate than the last. It was a message that stung as much for what it said as for what it threatened. Mr. Vale. I've always admired your brilliance, but brilliance cannot protect you from the truth forever. Your marriage to Eloan Price is nothing more than a distraction. Do you truly think Vailtech will survive the fallout from this charade? It's only a matter of time before your personal life unravels in a way that no PR firm can spin. The public is watching, and the board is waiting. I suggest you reconsider the legacy you leave behind. The letter was unsigned, but Cashin knew exactly who it was from. Percival Dorne's fingerprints were all over it. Cashin had exposed him at the board meeting, but this was Dorne's revenge, quiet, calculated, and aimed directly at his heart. The timing couldn't have been worse. Only 2 weeks remained before Eloan's due date. She was already feeling the weight of pregnancy, and the last thing he wanted was for her to feel the pressure of this new threat. But Cashin knew he couldn't let Dorne's games go unchallenged. He had to act, and he had to do it quickly. The next morning, he pulled Marcellus aside. The CFO's eyes narrowed as Cashin handed him the letter, his jaw tight with a quiet fury. Marcellus scanned the note, his lips pressed into a thin line. He'd been Cashin's right hand for years, but even Marcellus knew that no matter how well they played the game, Dorne's power was unmatched. It's time to go on the offensive, Cashin said, the words heavy in the air. We can't afford to be passive. We need to turn this against him. Marcellus nodded, already thinking through the strategy. We'll hit the media. Make it clear that this is an attempt to destabilize Vailtech. But we also need to leverage the employees, get the press to see the personal stakes, to understand that the company's growth isn't just about numbers. It's about heart. It's about the people who have always believed in you. Cashin looked at his reflection in the glass of his office window. He had always measured his worth by the weight of his decisions, by how many zeros sat at the end of a contract. But now, he had something far more precious to protect than wealth. His family. As they formulated their plan, the media whirlwind began. Dorne's influence was no longer subtle, it became overt. Anonymous leaks appeared on business news sites, casting doubt on Cashin's ability to lead. The headlines screamed about his scandalous marriage and questioned whether Vailtech was too distracted by its CEO's personal life to maintain its cutting-edge edge. Cashin's every move was scrutinized, his commitment to the company, his choice of Eloan as a partner, his ability to continue to innovate under pressure. Every piece of information that leaked served to destabilize the very thing Cashin had worked so hard to build. And the more they tried to fight back, the more the media seemed to twist the narrative. But Cashin was no stranger to adversity. He had clawed his way to the top, piece by piece, until he had no choice but to rise above it. He called an emergency press conference. The room was packed, reporters from every major outlet, all waiting for a sensational story. The cameras flashed as Cashin stepped to the podium, his expression calm but determined. Eloan, watching from the back of the room, stood beside Marcellus, both of them feeling the tension building. Eloan had never been one for the spotlight, and yet here she was, standing by the man who had become her everything, even in the face of this firestorm. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cashin began, his voice steady, "I stand before you today not as the CEO of Vailtech, but as a father, a husband, and a man who will not allow the future he is building to be dictated by anyone but those who believe in it. I've been called many things in the press, and some of it is true. I am a man who chose to marry the woman I love, to build a family, and to protect them at all costs." He paused, looking directly at the cameras. Eloan felt her breath catch. She had never seen him so vulnerable, so exposed. But there was strength in his words, too. "This company was never about stock prices or market margins for me," he continued. "Vailtech was born from a need to change lives, to provide value beyond what's measured on a balance sheet. The people I work with, the people I work for, they matter. And my family? They matter more. We will not be silenced by threats or manipulation. We will stand tall, because what we are building is bigger than any of us." The room fell silent. The reporters scribbled furiously, the weight of Cashin's declaration hanging in the air. The message was clear: this was no longer about business, it was about integrity, about doing what was right, no matter the cost. Eloan watched Cashin from the back of the room, her hand instinctively resting on her belly. The twins kicked in response to the energy in the room, as if they too were reacting to the fierce love that radiated from their father. She could see the future unfolding in front of her, one full of challenges, yes, but also full of purpose. After the conference, as the press scrambled to digest the news, Cashin returned to the penthouse, his shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks. He and Eloan spent the evening in quiet companionship, each knowing that the storm was far from over but somehow feeling a little more equipped to face it together. The next morning, Cashin woke early. He watched the sunrise from the kitchen window, feeling the weight of what was to come. The media was still buzzing, Dorne would retaliate, and the board was always just a step away from testing his resolve. But he no longer felt alone in this fight. Eloan's presence beside him, the life they were building, had changed something in him. He was no longer just a CEO, he was a protector, a partner, a father. The battle for Vailtech was far from over, but Cashin had a new clarity: he would not just fight for his company, he would fight for his family, and for the truth. No one, not even Dorne, could take that away from him. The city had shifted in a way Cashin didn't quite understand, or perhaps he had simply stopped understanding it the moment he began to see it through a different lens. Once, New York's sharp edges had drawn him in, its relentless pace a reflection of his own desires to conquer, control, and build. Now, with Eloan's hand resting on his as they sat in a quiet corner of the penthouse, the world beyond their glass walls felt distant. It was as though he could see the city, but he no longer needed it. The future he'd fought so hard to create no longer seemed to belong to him alone, it belonged to his family now. Despite the newfound peace that seemed to settle over them, the weight of the battle for Vailtech was far from gone. Cashin had proven that he wouldn't be intimidated, that he was prepared to fight for his family and for the company he had built from the ground up. But as much as he was determined, the cost had become apparent. Percival Dorne wasn't the kind of man who would give up without a fight, and the press still wasn't ready to let go of the scandalous angle that had first propelled Cassion's name into the headlines. As he sat across from Eloan, watching the flicker of the fire dance across her face, the sense of dread that had loomed over him since the pregnancy announcement still hadn't fully dissipated. He'd hoped that the boardroom battle had given him the upper hand, that the market's reaction to Larkspur's success would give him a reprieve, but the reality was much more complicated. Vailteca's future, it seemed, was tethered not just to the success of their next product but to how well Cassion could navigate a world that was far more interested in his personal life than his corporate genius. Eloan's pregnancy had already cast a long shadow over their lives, though neither of them spoke of it often. She had slipped into motherhood with a quiet grace, but the strain of the past months was evident in the small ways she moved and spoke. As much as Cassion tried to protect her from the media, the whispers followed them everywhere they went. People didn't look at Eloan and see the woman who had taken him by surprise, they saw the woman who had secured her place with a powerful CEO, and the weight of that perception weighed heavily on her shoulders. Cassion hated seeing it, hated the thought that Eloan's life, her very existence, was being reduced to a narrative that was not her own. As the weeks passed, they both tried to find a rhythm in the chaos. They spent evenings together, often in the nursery, where Eloan would read or sketch the designs for the space, and Cassion would try, desperately, to balance work and home life. But no matter how hard he tried, the weight of the impending board vote was always in the back of his mind. Dorne had made it clear, this wasn't just about leadership. This was about control. Cassion knew that if he didn't take decisive action, if he didn't consolidate his power, he could lose it all, not just the company, but everything he had worked so hard to protect. He couldn't afford to lose his sense of control, especially now. He wouldn't allow Dorne to dictate the future of Vailtech, to dictate the future of his family. It was during one of those long nights, when Eloan had finally fallen asleep, that Cassion made the decision. He called Marcellus and Kieran, the two people he trusted most in the world, and asked them to come to the penthouse the next morning for a meeting. He knew the stakes were high, and this time, it wasn't just about numbers, it was about reshaping the entire narrative, once and for all. The next morning, as the sun streamed through the high windows of the penthouse, Cassion stood before Marcellus and Kieran. The weight of what he was about to propose hung thick in the air. "We need to take the fight to them," Cassion said, his voice steady, his gaze unwavering. "We need to make it clear that Vailteca's future is not just about profit. It's about integrity. It's about the people who believe in what we're building." Marcellus nodded slowly, the weight of the decision apparent in his eyes. "And how do you propose we do that?" he asked, his voice measured but curious. Cassion paced for a moment, the ideas already taking shape in his mind. "We go public with everything. Every decision, every challenge we've faced, every victory we've had, everything." He turned to Kieran, who had been listening quietly. "We live stream a board meeting. We bring the entire team into the fold. The market needs to understand who we are, not just the executive team but everyone who believes in this company. It's time to show the world that Vailtech isn't just some faceless corporation, it's a family." Kieran raised an eyebrow. "You're asking for complete transparency. Are you prepared for the fallout?" "I don't have a choice," Cassion replied. "We've been operating in the shadows for too long. The market's been speculating about our future for months. It's time to put everything on the table. If we're going to win this fight, we need to let people see us for who we really are." Marcellus glanced at Kieran, then back at Cassion. "It's risky. But I think it's the only way to wrest control back from Dorne and the board. You're right, if we don't do something drastic, we might lose everything. But if we do this, we're committing to a level of transparency that might change the entire landscape of how businesses are run." Cassion nodded. "Exactly. No more games. No more manipulation. We'll show the world who we really are. And if the board can't get behind that, then they'll have to answer for it." The decision was made. They would move forward with Cassion's plan, but they knew it wouldn't be easy. The media would tear into them, the board would resist, and there would be no guarantee that the gamble would pay off. But for the first time in months, Cashin felt a surge of clarity. He wasn't just fighting for Vailteca's survival anymore, he was fighting for a new kind of leadership, one that was grounded in authenticity, not optics. Over the next week, the plans for the live-streamed board meeting took shape. Cashin and his team carefully crafted the narrative, outlining not just Vailteca's accomplishments but the personal stories of the employees who had helped build the company. He wanted to show the world that Vailtec was more than just a tech giant, it was a collective effort, a community of people who believed in the company's mission. When the day of the broadcast finally arrived, Cashin stood in front of the camera, flanked by Marcellus, Kieran, and the rest of the leadership team. The cameras were rolling, the world watching, and Cashin knew that this was it. This was the moment that would either make or break them. The broadcast began. Cashin introduced the board members, but instead of diving into financials, he started with the stories of the employees who had been with Vailtec since its early days, engineers, designers, and developers who had believed in the vision when no one else did. He talked about the challenges they had faced, the sacrifices they had made, and the belief that had kept them going. As the meeting unfolded, it became clear that this was not just a corporate update, it was a declaration. A declaration that Vailtec wasn't just a product of spreadsheets and stock options. It was a company built on values, on integrity, on vision, on the people who worked tirelessly to make it happen. By the time the meeting ended, the world had witnessed something rare, a CEO who had opened his life, his company, and his soul to the world. The media reacted in real time. Some still questioned his leadership, but many others applauded his bravery and vision. Vailteca's stock began to climb back, slowly at first, but steadily. The market was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, Cashin felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel, hope. That evening, as he sat with Aloan in their apartment, watching the news reports trickle in, Cashin finally let himself relax. The storm wasn't over, but they had weathered it. And together, they would face whatever came next. "I think we did it," Cashin said quietly, his arm around Aloan's shoulders. She looked up at him, a smile playing at the corners of her lips. "You didn't just do it. You changed the game." Cashin kissed her forehead, his hand resting on her growing belly. "We did it. And I'm not stopping now." Outside, the city hummed. But inside their apartment, Cashin and Aloan sat, the future unfolding before them, a new chapter waiting to be written.